morning. This is week 12 of the Introduction to Cultural Studies. 2 more to go. So today we'll talk about the British Empire and the cultural legacy of the British Empire. A very important subject for those of you who are interested in British studies, but with some implications also to the history and culture of the United States and some other places, even Poland, if you think about that. So let's look at the legacy of the British Empire. So first of all, of course, we need to talk about history a little bit. At the end of the 19th century, Great Britain was an imperial country. It had colonies all over the world. There was a popular saying that Britain was the empire over which the sun never set, because it was so large. It was actually the largest empire ever created by people. So you can see the map here showing the empire at its greatest point of territorial expansion. In fact, if you look at the details, it never existed in this form, because the 13 colonies in America got their independence in the late 18th century, when some of the colonies, for example, in Africa, were not yet part of the British Empire. But this is the map of the world with the greatest number of countries that ever were parts of the British Empire. As you can see, Canada and originally also the American colonies, large parts of Africa, also the entire continent of Australia, New Zealand, India, as you can see, quite a huge area in Asia also. The Arab countries, as you can see here, not all of them were technically speaking colonies. Places like Egypt, for example, were never technically a colony of Britain, but they were, let's say, quite influenced by the British politics and administration and trade, so they could be seen as let's say, part of the area of influence of the British Empire. If you would like to know something more, there are a couple of books and also a documentary series that I can recommend to you. Here you have some. There are 2 books, and there were actually documentary series made to accompany these books. So if you would like to watch them as well, this is quite an interesting thing. So both are entitled Empire, as you can see. One by Neil Ferguson, a Scottish historian. He's mostly interested in the history of economy. So, for example, his hypothesis, his idea is that the empire started to dissolve in the 20th century despite having won 2 world wars, because it went bankrupt. I think it's quite convincing. So this is Neil Ferguson, the entire history of the empire from its beginning to the dissolution after the Second World War. The other book is by Jeremy Paxman, also called Empire, and it's more about the legacy of the British Empire from a rather positive standpoint. We'll talk about the critics of the empire slightly later today, but actually Jeremy Paxman traveled around the world and talked to the people in the former colonies and tried to see if anything positive has remained of the imperial period, and he believes that there were actually some things. Another recommendable documentary, I think it's a 4-part documentary, Queen Victoria's Empire. So if you can find it online, it's very interesting. It gives you quite a good introduction to the history of the British Empire in the 19th century during the reign of Queen Victoria. This is also when the empire was at its greatest, and this was generally seen as the source of national pride, so a very important cultural aspect of the late Victorian period. So of course you can find more. There are quite a lot of interesting books and films on this subject. We'll talk about a few more, but this is perhaps a good place to start. So as I said, we need to talk very briefly about the history of the British Empire. It could be subdivided into a few periods, as you can see here. The so-called First British Empire, so the first moment in history from the late 16th century when Britain starts to have colonies abroad. Then the Second British Empire in the 18th century, and the Regency period. So if you remember, Regency period is the first decade or first decades of the 19th century. Then the Imperial century from 1815 to 1914, that is the 19th century, including the Victorian period, until the outbreak of the First World War. Then the period of the two world wars, so the first half of the 20th century, and whatever happened later, which is basically the time of decline of the empire, the dissolution of the former colonies, and decolonization, which will also have a very massive impact on culture studies, on literature studies. You'll see some scholars who basically devoted their careers to analyzing the legacy of the British Empire. So a little about the beginnings, so the first British Empire. It's generally believed that the first colony that England, this is even before the unification with Scotland, because this was in the times of Queen Elizabeth I, so in the Tudor period. Queen Elizabeth I gave a patent for discovery and overseas exploration. This is the time of the great English explorers like Drake and Raleigh. These are the times of colonial expansion by other European countries, especially the countries of the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal. They really invest in geographical exploration. They fund the great expeditions of Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Magellan. Also, not just because of curiosity, but they want to conquer new lands. They want to conquer the new world, the Americas, and exploit them for resources, mostly for gold. So England under Elizabeth I tries to take part in this colonial race. So the first English colony was in America, in present-day Carolina. This is something very famous and mysterious in the history of America, and later in the history of the United States. This is a kind of foundation myth for them, the colony called Roanoke. This was the first English colony which mysteriously disappeared when the ships from England arrived. A few years later, they found a completely abandoned site and no people. It's not known what happened? Did they move somewhere else? Were they killed by I don't know, an epidemic? Did they die fighting with the Native Americans? It's really not known, and there are quite a few stories and hypotheses, but this was really the first European colony, or English, not European, English colony in America, in the area that would later contribute to the United States. So then there were, as you know, hopefully, the 13 colonies which declared independence in 1776. There was a relatively short war with England, and the colonies came out victorious. So this was probably the first large-scale democratic country. Definitely something completely new, something that would gradually, of course, become the dominant power in the Western culture, and in the 20th century it would actually even supersede Britain. As far as British colonial expansion goes, they tried to focus on the East, on India. East India Company was established for trade, and they became very successful, very wealthy, and so from a purely commercial operation, which was basically a merchant company, a trading company, it developed into a kind of a state in its own right, with especially most importantly a private army to protect the company's interests in India. Also at this time, Britain was colonizing the Caribbean, especially the area of Jamaica. This was the place with quite a lot of commercial activity as well, especially the plantations of sugar, tobacco, coffee. These were all very labor-intensive areas of agriculture, so a lot of manpower was used to cultivate those highly profitable plants, and increasingly this whole operation started to rely on slavery. So it's not only America, not only the American colonies in the South that relied on slave labor and had millions of people, mostly from Africa, brought to America to work as slaves on the plantations. It's also Britain, especially in the 18th century. This is something that Britain is not very proud, understandably, of, but the great fortunes of the 18th century, of the early 19th century, most of the banks that started operating in Britain developed on the profits of slave trade and slave labor. Of course, slavery was abolished in the 19th century in Britain, much earlier than it was in America. So this is something that Britain is very proud of, that they were the first country to abolish slave trade and to outlaw the possession of slaves long, like half a century almost, earlier than the American colonies and the United States of America, but the fact that they had slaves is not really something very noble, if you think about that. So the beginning of the colonial expansion was based on rivalry with other countries like Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, France to some extent, and the production and trade in luxury products. Luxury products such as tea in the 18th century, if you remember, we talked about it when we talk about the cultural impact of food culture. So of course tea production, tea consumption in Britain became something of a status symbol, and it had to be brought from Asia, especially from China. That's why also all the paraphernalia of tea drinking, the cups and pots and other small utensils made of porcelain, they became known collectively as China because they were brought from China. Also luxury fabrics such as high quality Indian fabrics, Indian cotton, also silk fabrics from Asia. This really started to influence British and Western generally economy, consumerism, and it added to the further colonial expansion. So we are now in the 18th century. This is a poster with a very famous phrase, "Rule Britannia." This is the title of a song, very popular patriotic song from the 18th century. Here you have some lyrics. Britannia ruled the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. Yes, that's the lyrics of this song, which is still sometimes sung, especially by right-wing politicians and their voters, because otherwise, really, if you think about it, Britons never shall be slaves, but they were quite happy to enslave other people. So that's the way that the empire was built. The 18th century is the time of the exploration of the Pacific. This is the time of the establishment of British colonies in Australia and New Zealand, initially as penal colonies. That means the colonies that would operate as camps for prisoners. So people who were convicted of some crimes, usually not the most serious crimes, but like theft or prostitution, they might be exiled to the colonies. So they would very often go to Australia and New Zealand, and after serving time in the prisons established there, they were released and they were free to start new life in the colonies. So the British, the European presence in Australia and New Zealand really started with, you might say, petty criminals and small-time crooks establishing their own society. That's the very important and rather unusual side of these places. Canada was also subdued by Britain. This type of colonies, these were sometimes called colonies of white settlement. So they were not only exploited for resources, but also they were treated as extra land for the British. Of course, Britain is an island with the growing population. It was quite impossible to provide more living space for people. The European countries were quite difficult to conquer. So rather than engage in European wars, Britain started to establish colonies far away from the motherland, and to see them as the so-called colonies of white settlement. That is, the colonies were new cities were established by the immigrants, and women were brought. Whole families were brought to live in the new place and to colonize the new place. Of course, these were not deserted areas. These were areas that had the native population of the American Indians, as they were called then, the Australian Aborigines, in New Zealand, the Maori population, and of course, if these areas were to be vacated for the European settlers, these populations were a disadvantage. So what we have is basically the extermination of the natives. So even though we have the abolition of slavery, which mostly means African slaves, in 1807, the extermination of native populations of Canada and especially Australia and New Zealand continues well into the 19th century, and in some aspects also later. If you are interested in that, that's why really all those horrible things about the persecution of the native populations in Australia, in the reservations for the natives, in Canada, those boarding schools where children were taken by force and basically turned into obedient servants, maybe not slaves, but servants of the British Empire. This continues well into the 20th century, probably until the end of the 20th century, and only now we are beginning to see the extent of those atrocities. So that's the 18th century. If we move to the 19th century, this is what is generally called by the historians the Imperial Age. So the Victorian Age, the colonization, the subjugation of India, which became known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. That is the largest, perhaps the largest, definitely the most wealthy and culturally advanced, artistically advanced colony in the British Empire. This was, as I said, originally run as a trading operation by the East India Company. Later, this was really the wholesale conquest, culminating perhaps in 1857 when the Indians rebelled for the first time. This is called the Indian Mutiny, especially in British history books. This was, if you remember, we talked about it when we talked about food. This was this scandal with the new type of rifles and the new type of bullets that you had to bite with your teeth, and the bullets were greased with some strange fatty substance, and the native soldiers were quite worried about breaking religious taboos, both for the Hindus and for the Muslims, and it resulted in a very bloody uprising, which was cruelly suppressed by the British. After that, East India Company was disbanded, and India became the colony ruled from London. Soon enough, Queen Victoria was given the title of the Empress of India. We'll talk about it in a moment. If we look at the Victorian morality, again something we have already discussed a little bit, part of the Victorian worldview was generally the concept of the moral mission. The belief that the British were the most civilized nation in the world, so as such it was their moral obligation to civilize the barbarians, the less civilized areas. This is sometimes called the white man's burden. You'll see why in a little moment. What happens in this imperial age? We have two more things. We have a rivalry with Russia in Asia. It's sometimes called the Great Game. We have a lot of cultural representations of that. It's usually the kind of war of spies. So it's like the first Cold War with Russia, if you think about it. It's the war of spies, because the Russian Empire wanted to protect their interests in Asia, especially around the area of Afghanistan. And this bordered with India, where British had their interests to protect. So there is this very complicated and sophisticated political and diplomatic rivalry with Russia, mostly done through trade influence, political influence, and spies, espionage. This is something very, very important for the Victorian period. Also, we have great stories of colonial heroes, and the greatest of them all was Dr. Livingstone. He was a Christian missionary and something of a geographical explorer who was sent to Africa to make some maps for the Geographic Society, and he got lost. He got lost quite famously, so a rescue operation was brought from England, led by another great explorer, Henry Morton Stanley. And after a few years, everything was really documented, and the news was discussed in national press, and Stanley was sending correspondence to newspapers, and everybody was really quite excited about this search. And finally, Dr. Livingstone was found in some very remote village somewhere in the middle of Africa, and here we have a contemporary image. So in 1871, the 10th of November, Henry Morton Stanley meets Dr. David Livingstone, and because they were English gentlemen and they have not been introduced before, this is what happened. Very polite greeting with a very famous phrase, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. So as you can see, even in the deserts and jungles of Africa, politeness and good manners were absolutely paramount. And we continue in a moment. I mentioned the phrase white man's burden. This comes from a poem by Rudyard Kipling, one of the greatest literary authors, the writers connected with the empire. He had an experience in Asia. He lived there for a very long time, and he wrote stories and novels and poetry, mostly praising the empire. And one of the poems that really heated the national imagination was entitled White Man's Burden. So here you have a contemporary illustration showing the personification of England, John Bull, going uphill and carrying on his back all kind of native peoples, as you can see, mostly from Asia. So there is a stereotypical Chinese man and possibly an Indian man, possibly a Turkish man, and some more characters here on the back of John Bull, being dragged uphill, so brought to light, brought to civilization by England. And here's the fragment of the poem itself. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons in exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This has everything if you look at it. So the white man's burden, the idea that the white man, culturally rather really than racially, are the best, the most civilized, and so they have to serve the captives, they have to serve the servants, the slaves of the empire. So their function is on one hand to rule over those colonized peoples, and on the other hand to teach them, to be a kind of teacher, a father figure perhaps, to those people. So something between a policeman and a teacher, because those Asian natives are half devil and half child. So they are at the same time dangerous and unruly, so they need to be kept under control, but also they are naive and stupid. Yeah, so they need to be educated, especially in morality. So this is really what most British citizens believed at the end of the 19th century. Even though you might say the influence went both ways, so there was the legacy of the empire also in Britain, with things like the bungalow, a type of architecture, a type of house that was quite popular in the hot climates. This is something that the British observed and learned in India. Also, the things like pyjamas. This is a new invention because in the hot climate it was quite easy for the colonial masters when they were sleeping. And traditionally, before the 19th century, people either slept in long shirts, it's like a sleeping shirts, the night gowns, night shirts, both sexes, or they slept in the nude. But if it was in a very hot climate, you might uncover yourself, and this was shameful, to be naked in front of the servants. And of course the colonial administrators had lots of servants. They were waited on hand and foot by the natives, especially in India. This was something that very many sons of the middle class families would see as a great professional success, to become an administrator in India, or generally in the colonies. Their living conditions would be much better than in England. Also, you would have lots and lots and lots of servants, including cooks, who would cook spicy dishes such as the curry that would be immediately very fashionable in Britain. Even Queen Victoria wanted to eat curry. This was something exotic and interesting and much more flavoursome than the typical traditional food of Britain. So this was really the areas of influence in everyday life, in the type of houses, the type of clothes, the type of dishes that became popular. Also, there is this popular imagery of the colonies. Here we have an advertisement of Pearce soap, and as you can see, it has a royal warrant. This is actually by appointment by the Prince of Wales. So this company provided soap and other, let's say, household chemical goods for the royal court, for the Prince of Wales. And here we have a rather racist image of a white boy using Pearce soap to clean a black boy so much that he is white, so he's like civilized. Yeah, I don't think it would be acceptable now, but this is really what was happening at the end of the 19th century, in the late imperial age. We also have a very interesting Polish book that deals precisely with that, with the white man's burden, with British colonialism, and this is the famous book. Those of you who are Polish and those of you who went to Polish high schools, or maybe even the primary schools, I don't know where they read it. You have read it. I'm sure you have read it. W pustyni I w puszczy, in desert and wilderness. And most people who remember reading it when they were kids, they were completely unaware of all the colonial context. And if you read it again, and I strongly recommend you do it at some point, you will see how much Poland, and of course Sienkiewicz, who wrote it, who was a kind of international star of literature. He got a Nobel Prize, so an international prize for literature. And this was something he wrote about a corporation of engineers. So there is an English engineer who's the father of the heroine, Nell, and a Polish engineer who has a son, Staś. And we have exactly that. White man's burden and cultural, moral, religious superiority of the Europeans over those Africans, either the Arab Africans or the black Africans. We have all kinds of adventures happening to those children, especially to Staś, who is like the beautiful blonde-haired Polish boy who is brave and honest, and he takes good care of Nell, so this English girl who is much younger than him. And here we have two illustrations from one edition of W pustyni I w puszczy. So we have Staś in front of the Muslim leader, the Mahdi. And if you read the book, you probably remember this, when this fearsome Muslim leader wants to scare Staś into converting to Islam, and he says, "No, I am Christian like my father." And even those bloodthirsty savages are very impressed by his bravery. Then we have another of the adventures with the Africans. So we have those two characters who come from some sort of African tribe, Kali and Mea. So we have this boy and girl, not much older than Staś, but they are the natives. They live there. Actually, Kali is the son of a local king, and still he worships Staś as the white master, the Vana Kupfa, if you remember that. If you read the book, you probably remember that. So absolutely the white man's burden and the idea that this Polish boy being European and Christian and blonde is somehow better than both the Arabs and the black Africans. And if you think about it, Poland at this time was a colony. It was a political non-entity. There wasn't a Poland on the map of the world. It was divided by the stronger neighbors, so Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary. So we have the writer from one colony writing about colonial superiority of his nation. Just think about that. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And one of the characters mentioned and very important in this story is General Gordon. So here we have a Victorian image of General Gordon and his very publicized and brave fight against the forces of the Mahdi. So again, this Muslim warlord, General Gordon, died in the siege of an African city of Khartoum, and when Stash and Nell go there, they actually see his head on a spike displayed for everyone to see as a kind of sign of victory and sign of humiliation of the English colonists. But of course he is seen as a hero, and if you know anything about the history of General Gordon, his death sparked massive outrage in Britain, and there was a penal expedition sent to Africa, and the Muslim forces were crushed completely by the British. It wasn't even in their colony, so they just went there to avenge this English adventurer. He was more of an adventurer than a military man, really. So the late imperial age, when Queen Victoria was given the additional title of the Empress of India in 1876, this is really something that dominates the colonial themes, the imperial themes that dominate the British culture of the turn of the century. There are some other subjects, some of them quite dark, even for the British themselves. So we have, for example, the Scramble for Africa, which was the rivalry of European powers, including some new ones like the newly unified Germany, for colonies in Africa. So here we have another colonial, you might say, hero or anti-hero of Britain, called Cecil Rhodes in South Africa. This leads to the Boer War, so the rivalry developing into a full-scale war between two colonial powers. One was, of course, Britain. The other one were the Boers, that is the settlers, kind of German-speaking settlers from the Netherlands. And the Boer War, which was fought at the turn of the 20th century, turned out to be the first modern dirty war. Very dishonorable. This was something that was also discovered by the British press, and much of the reading public was basically shocked by what was happening. For example, concentration camps. The first concentration camps were not used by the Germans. They were invented by the British during the Boer War to actually relocate the local Dutch population that were helping the Boer fighters, but these weren't designed to be death camps. But of course, this is what happened with the shortages of food, with some sort of contagious diseases spreading. So there were really horrible conditions, and thousands of those people imprisoned in the camps died. And this was something that actually Nazi Germany used for propaganda before the Second World War, in the interwar period, and in the first years of the war. And here we have a poster of a German film called Uncle Kruger, Kruger. Kruger was the name of the leader of the Boers, so the main opponent of the British Empire in South Africa. And here we have those Boers presented as very heroic and noble, and of course the British as beastly and barbaric colonists. So you can find it somewhere. It's very interesting. It's of course a propaganda film, but it's very well done. Another horrible atrocities that started to happening in the late imperial age were happening in Congo. So this was a private colony of the King of Belgium. So actually the King of the Belgians, he bought some land in Africa. The land was actually larger in size than Belgium. So this was his private land, and he exploited the colony mostly for rubber. And this was something absolutely horrendous. And here we have a photograph of a young African man, and his hand was cut off. Because this was what the colonists, the Belgian colonists were doing in Congo. If the natives did not provide enough resources, they would be punished in the most horrible way by, I don't know, cutting off their limbs or something. And again, we have a very interesting literary reaction to that by Joseph Conrad. So if you know, he was a Polish writer who went to Britain, and he had a wonderful career in English language. So he actually learned English in his as a second language, but he was so fluent with in it, and that he wrote books. And his most famous book is Heart of Darkness, and this is precisely about that, about the colonial atrocities in Congo. So that's what starts happening. So the horrors of the empire, and if you remember, the main hero of Heart of Darkness dies actually uttering the word, the horror, and we as readers are left wondering what horror he means, and it's probably the horror of the empire, the horror of the colonial expansion and the atrocities committed against the native people in Africa. So as you can see, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we have really the first voices against the empire as a kind of concept, which leads to the dissolution of the empire in the 20th century. So we have something that Neil Ferguson proposed, the huge financial crisis after the two world wars, even though Britain was in the winning team, if you think about that. So that's quite paradoxical, but the victories in the world wars were so costly that Britain was no longer able to support this vast empire, and it started dissolving. Another thing that starts after the war, especially after the Second World War, is the global domination of the United States of America. This is something that we have already discussed when we talked about modernity, and this is a very important cultural event or the element of culture that is really important in discussing the dissolution of the empire as well. So America started its existence as a colony, and later they did not really evolve into creating a typical empire with typical foreign colonies. They relied on political domination, economic domination, but not really empire building in the traditional sense. So what we have first of all is the decolonization of India, with the figure of Gandhi, whom you can see here in the photograph, using very innovative and very effective methods of resistance, such as passive resistance, so kind of peaceful resistance to the colonial power. And he was successful because of the impact of the public opinion, of the media, of the political influence. So India was granted independence in 1947. This resulted in its own set of problems. The country was divided into India and Pakistan roughly along the religious lines. So India was a majority Hindu country, Pakistan was a majority Muslim country, and this resulted in mass relocations of people from one part of the subcontinent to another, which quite predictably led to massacres and fighting, and I guess several million people were affected, with lots of them actually being killed by kind of mutual massacres. The British were blamed because they just abandoned India, and they never took any responsibility for the problems they themselves created through the colonial expansion. But that was the situation, not only in India, in other places that were former colonies as well. For example, in the Holy Land, so the British mandate in Palestine, it ended also after the Second World War in 1980. In 1948, the British withdrew from Palestine, and the State of Israel was created, creating its own problems. So there was a constant tension in the region, resulting in several wars, and the British again washed their hands of the whole problem. And some more problems, the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Irish Troubles again. This is, well, Ireland is sometimes seen as the nearest colony to Britain, but the way that this island was treated was really a kind of colonial manner, especially because of the religious differences. So the Troubles means the civil war between the Catholics and the Protestants that lasted for the remainder of the 20th century. There was also the Falklands War in the 1980s, resulting from the tensions between Britain and Argentina for some small archipelago in the very cold regions of South America, which didn't have any real value except for the strategic value. So there was probably the last colonial war fought by the British and won by Mrs. Thatcher. She was very proud of that. The last thing here is the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. So again, the withdrawal from something that Britain had since the middle of the 19th century as the result of opium wars. Yes, the British colonial power, the military might, supported the drug trade in China because it was profitable, and they crushed the Chinese fleet. They actually made the emperor sign the treaty and hand over some land in China, like Hong Kong, which was only given back to China in 1997. So as you can see, this was the time of trouble, the 50 years after the Second World War. This was the time of trouble. We also have this image from a cartoon called Colonel Blimp, and this was again a stereotypical image from popular press showing the kind of hard-headed Britain in support of the colonial expansion of the empire, and here you can see him actually doing the Nazi salute. So evidently, the author of the cartoon was against this kind of rhetoric and against the empire, showing it as a kind of potentially dangerous totalitarian thing. So what remained? Here we have some things that are usually mentioned as a positive result of colonialism. So the infrastructure, especially the railways, the system of education, the system of justice in the former colonies, parliamentary democracy, the civil service, so the whole system of bureaucracy, capitalist economy, the popularity of Protestantism, Church of England and other Protestant religions, some sports like cricket and rugby, which are now part of the Commonwealth Games. So they have their own Olympics because they have this international organization called the Commonwealth, which groups the former colonies of Britain. So it's a voluntary organization, but as you can see, many of those former colonies decide to join that because it brings the profits, it brings the financial and economic aid from Britain, and also they have the sporting competition like the Commonwealth Games. So here you have a poster from one of them. So some traditionally British sports like cricket and rugby that were extremely popular in the colonies, not only played by the colonial administrators, by the native people as well, and of course, first and foremost, the development of English as the world language. So the absolute supremacy of the English language as the primary means of international communication. This is definitely the legacy of the British Empire. And it might be said that in the former colonies, where English was generally taught to all kids at school, this gave them some sort of advantage. But I would say that nowadays the consensus seems to be that the empire brought more evil than good. So let's see what happened. So let's now talk about the cultural response to the legacy of the British Empire, and especially the theory of post-colonialism and some examples of how this theory can be used. So post-colonialism is basically the study of colonialism and imperialism. These are very similar concepts. You can see the definitions here. So colonialism means extending and retaining the authority over territories and people for the benefit of the colonizing country. So basically the expanding of the colonial power. And imperialism means a nation extending its power by acquisition of lands or by purchase, diplomacy or military force. So it doesn't need to be fully integrating into the state of the colonial power. It could be just cultural domination. And of course, if we talk about cultural domination, the concept of imperialism is much larger than the concept of colonialism, because many countries used to be thoroughly dominated through diplomacy or politics or cultural dominance by the West without being formally colonies, without being incorporated into, let's say, the British Empire. So post-colonialism is generally interested in the voices of the colonized people and their identity. So this is the attempt to actually listen to the experience of the members of the groups, basically nations or ethnicities, that were subdued by the colonialism or the imperialism. So it's usually a very sad story of suppression, exploitation, humiliation, slavery, rape, generally sexual exploitation as well. Why did it happen, and how was it even possible for those highly civilized European nations like the British, but not only, basically all imperial powers, to embark on this large-scale politics and practice, really, of exploitation? This was, according to those scholars, and you'll see some names in a moment, this was basically achieved through creating a certain mental framework, frame of mind that would allow people to exploit or even sometimes kill other people from other cultures, people of other skin color, religion, whatever, and still feel good about themselves. So to perceive themselves as colonizers, to perceive themselves as servants, as the servants of the white man's burden. What happened? What could happen in the mind of a person or even a group of people, like the employees of the East India Company, that would turn them from moral men into oppressors? And post-colonial studies suggest that this was really done through the process of othering. Remember when we talked about modernity? The concept of the other. So your identity, or anybody's identity, is always created in opposition with the other. And if you put the colonized peoples in the position of the other, you can see them as all of the things here: savage, uncivilized, godless, stupid, naive, violent, sexually easy. So all the negative things connected with half devil and half child, that's the othering. And if you think of the Victorian way of thinking, Victorian values, this was all based on binary oppositions. So if we use the system of binary oppositions against the colonized people, that's what we have. We have full working framework for enslavement. Because if they are savage, they need to be disciplined. If they are uncivilized, they need to be taught. If they are godless, they need to be converted to the true religion. If they are stupid, they need to be looked after. If they are naive, they need to be protected. If they are violent, they need to be policed. And if they are sexually easy, they are basically easy prey for anyone who would like to take advantage of them, especially women. Not only, but especially women. So this is really presenting the other, in this case the colonial other, but it could be anyone deemed the other, as not fully human. And here we have some posters from the interwar period showing basically some sort of racist attitudes towards the perceived enemy and showing the perceived enemy as not fully human. So first we have an American image of the Japanese. So this is the enemy. We have a kind of horrible looking, crouching Japanese soldier dragging a beautiful, probably fainted white woman, maybe to rape her, if you think about that, because she's kind of naked, or is she naked? Yeah. So this is the enemy. He is savage. He's not fully human. He's violent and savage. The other one is actually a Russian poster which shows the Jews as the pest of the nations, Zaraza Narodov. And we have this stereotypical image of a Jew counting money among the skulls. So he's dangerous, he's scheming, he's not stupid or savage, he's scheming and uncivilized. And perhaps also violent, but not in this kind of physical aggression way, but he wants to subdue you, us, the humans. He's not fully human. Again, we need to be protected against them. A very similar rhetoric was also used by the Nazis against the Jews and led to the Holocaust. The third one is also American, and it shows the Germans as an ape, as a kind of gorilla. So you have a gorilla wearing a very characteristic German helmet, with the phrase "destroy this mad brute." A brute could mean a human so much, but also a kind of beast. And this beast, like this kind of huge King Kong, he carries in his arms, again, a very passive, probably fainting, white woman in flowing gowns who needs protection. So this is really what the process of othering can do in creating a mindset of dehumanizing the other. And in this case, these are the war posters. So the natural reaction they wanted to elicit is actually to encourage the brave young men to join the army and kill the savages, destroy the savages. This kind of rhetoric could be used against anyone, any kind of political, ethnic, racial, other, sexual, so any kind of other. And this is something that post-colonial theory explored extensively. And here we have 4 names of, you might say, the leaders, the people who started this branch of humanities. Some of them still alive, luckily for us, and still very, very influential through their work. So the grandfather, the founding father of post-colonial theory would be definitely Edward Said. Edward Said was born in Jerusalem, in British-occupied Jerusalem, so in the time when Jerusalem was under British mandate, the British occupation, in a family which he himself described as Arab Christians. So Christian by religion, Arab by ethnicity. He wrote quite a lot about the process of othering, and especially from his own experience, so the Middle East, and how the images of Asia, especially especially the Middle East, but it could also be used, for example, in the discussion of Indian presence, of British presence in India, how they created the image of the other. And his most influential book, still a very good book, if you want to read one book from post-colonial studies, or if you want to do anything touching on post-colonial studies, you will end up reading this book, Orientalism, 1978. This is the book about how the Western world perceives the Orient meaning Asia, but especially, in his view, the Middle East. So, as you can see, this could be romanticized image. This could be something, if you look at especially the late 19th century paintings showing the Arab countries, showing the Holy Land, so Jerusalem and the land now of Israel, which was extremely popular for travelers. Showing India to some extent through paintings, through literary depictions, also through films. This is a romanticized image, so it's beautiful, it's seductive, it's interesting. In some way, it's much more interesting than the European culture and the British culture. But at the same time, the people there are irrational, weak, and feminized. Feminized, of course, this means the women, of course, wearing those beautiful exotic costumes of the Orient, but also the men who are not masculine enough. They wear jewelry, they wear bright colors, they wear robes rather than trousers. So this makes them at the same time irrational and potentially violent, because they are judged by impulses, by emotions. They fight all the time, according to this rhetoric. And they are weak, mentally weak. They don't have the philosophy, they don't have the true religion, of course, they don't have the true culture that can be only brought to them by the white people. It's not really a racial thing, it's more cultural and ethnic, but there is an element of racism here as well. So the concept of Orientalism and the way that the West constructed the perception of the East. This is the fundamental book. Then we have another scholar, and her name is Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, and it sounds Slavic, but it's the name she took from her husband. Originally, this scholar was born in Calcutta, in India, so she was the subject of the British Empire, as you can see, born in 1942, and she's mostly remembered for the introduction of the concept of the subaltern. Subaltern, if you remember Antonio Gramsci, the Italian anti-fascist who became so influential for left-wing scholars and Frankfurt School especially, his idea of hegemony, so the cultural dominance rather than military dominance. So the people outside of the hegemonic power, so the colonized people, the word that Gramsci used to describe them was subaltern. It's like the servant, the other, the subdued. This is the word he used, and this is the word that Gayatri Spivak took, and she used it for post-colonial studies. So basically, she wrote a very influential article, Can the Subaltern Speak? And this is how she popularized this concept, and it became a very useful concept for describing the perspective of the colonized people. So people who are denied the right, the privilege to discuss and analyze their own culture. Because if you are the other in some sort of power structure of the colony or other hegemonic power, you are not allowed to speak. You are discussed, you are depicted, sometimes in what seems to be quite a positive way. So you could be seen as beautiful, you could be seen as attractive, you could be seen as exotic, but you are never given the right to speak, to actually tell your own story, to give your own perspective on your own culture and the way that that the colonists, who are the other for you, discuss your culture. And this realization is really at the very basis of post-colonial studies, that the colonized peoples and other, let's say, underprivileged groups should be allowed to tell their story. So there we go. Two more names. One is another Indian scholar, a kind of English American. He now works in America. Homi K. Bhabha, born in Mumbai, India, and he's still active. And actually, I put here the poster for the lecture that he gave in Warsaw just a few weeks ago. So you can actually Google that. You can Google the title and you can see the entire lecture. So quite impressive, really very, very interesting. He works in Harvard now, and his wife Jacqueline is also a professor there. They both came as guests for the Humanities Congress, and they both gave lectures. You can actually hear them speak, and as you can see, they talk about broadly understood post-colonial issues, such as the racial problems in America. This is the topic of his lecture, and the problems with migration in the modern world. This is the topic of her lecture. So yeah, absolutely. Homi Bhabha, one of the great minds of post-colonial studies, a very, very good lecturer, and I strongly advise you just look it up and see this lecture. His probably most influential book was The Location of Culture in 1994, and he introduced several concepts to the field of humanities, like the concept of hybridity. This is something that he spent quite a lot of time discussing. So new cultural forms emerging from multiculturalism. He was born in India, he lived in Britain, he lives now in America, so in modern multicultural societies, and he, being of course of the Indian heritage, he's quite interested in how the modern societies use the post-colonial legacy, and how they develop in new ways, influenced by the different cultures of origin of the people who form them. So hybridity is one of the ways that new cultural elements are formed through collaboration and sometimes tension between different cultures that coexist in modern societies. Another thing, ambivalence. Culture consists of opposing conceptions and dimensions. So this is one of the ways that hybridity works, is through ambivalence. That is kind of a little bit similar to Derrida's aporia. So kind of feeling lost, feeling in two minds. So if you are at the same time, let's say, American or British, but your family came from elsewhere, and some elements of the original culture were protected in your upbringing. This could be the tension within an individual human, not only communities, not only cultures as such. For Bhabha and most other post-colonial studies scholars, this is a thing. This kind of makes the modern world interesting and enriched. The other thing, this is something that he was quite interested in, at least initially, is the concept of mimicry. So how the subaltern, how the people othered by the colonial structure try to imitate the dominant culture. So especially in the Indian culture during the Raj, so the British dominance, there was a concept of the mimic man, or the word that the Indians used was babu. And here we have the photograph of such a person. So that would be an Indian person, usually a man, because they had better access to education and employment. So an Indian man educated in the English values, usually fluent in the English language, usually with quite high education obtained from schools run by the colonists, very often converted to Protestant Christianity and trying to adopt the cultural practices of the British. So British style of dress, British food, British leisure activities, which very often resulted in the situation that such people were not accepted either by the culture of origin or the dominant culture. So they were somehow hanging in between, in a rather sad position between the cultures. So quite ambivalent position if you think about it. This would be the extreme example of cultural ambivalence. So somebody who tries to embody the dominant culture, but there are some things about his legacy and even the kind of physical looks that point strongly to the culture of origin, and such a person's identity has to be hybrided, has to be mediated between these opposing elements. The fourth name I'd like to acquaint you with is Stuart Hall, who was born in Jamaica. He was one of the founders of the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, so in English with Jamaican origin. And he is mostly remembered for his work on reception theory, so encoding and decoding of cultural meanings. He believed that the message relies on social context. It is obtained through negotiation and resistance. He was mostly interested, of course, in modern post-colonial multicultural society in Britain. So he was quite interested in the construction of prejudice, in the ways that othering works, and also the creation of new cultural practices in multicultural societies. So somehow similar to what Homi Bhabha is doing, but more in the British perspective, and also he was more interested in the formation of meaning rather than cultural practices. So how people really understand elements of culture and how this understanding relies on the social context, so on their background, on their education, upbringing, and so on. So just to finish off, a few very recent things. So two books, very recent books that actually criticize the legacy of the British Empire. So